Hello and welcome to the Feeling Good podcast. I am your host, Fabrice, and joining me here in the Murrieta studios is Dr. David Burns. Hi, David.
Hi, Fabrice.
Dr. David Burns has been a pioneer in the development of cognitive therapy, and he is the creator of the new team therapy. He is the author of Feeling Good, which has sold over 5 million copies in the United States and has been translated into over 20 languages. He is an emeritus adjunct clinical professor of psychiatry at the Stanford University School of Medicine. Welcome to episode 68 of the Feeling Good podcast, and we're continuing today with the 5 secrets of effective communication. And today we're going to talk about inquiry. Yes, I know David promised that we would do the I feel technique, but we have Helen here with us. Hi, Helen.
Hello.
And they're full of really good ideas on this particular part of the 5 secrets. So we thought that we would talk about this today. By the way, and Merry Christmas. This is being published on Christmas Day.
Oh, wow.
And so...
Don't tell me more about that.
Tell me more. Yes, so that would be inquiry, right? Unskillful inquiry that's made to detract the announcer from doing his job.
Yeah.
So, yes.
I just say we're really lucky to have you back again today, Helen. You're getting a lot of fans, by the way, through the podcast. And before we go on to inquiry,
you had some questions that you received from.
And usually you read these, and we'll do a role reversal here, and I'll be the one reading the feedback.
Yeah, because they're criticizing me probably.
Yeah. But I've been getting a ton of great emails from people and great questions from people. So this is from Kat. And Kat says, first of all, I'm a big fan of your podcasts. Thank you so much. And a smiley face, so thank you for that, Kat. I have a question about the disarming technique. That's the one we did before, thought and feeling empathy. That's the definition of disarming technique, is when you find truth in what the other person is saying rather than arguing defensively. How can it best be used when a person is being aggressive and insulting you? I guess what I'm trying to learn is how to stay calm in such a situation, voice the truth I hear and feel from the person, but also try to be assertive about the fact that it is not appropriate for them to say certain things in an angry tone.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah. What do you think?
I think, first of all, the question I'd want to ask Kat or ask myself if somebody was saying something to me and being aggressive and insulting is if what my goal with that relationship is. Because I think about using the 5 secrets in order to get closer to someone. And if someone is being aggressive and insulting to me, I might not want to get closer to that person. That might be someone that I would prefer to avoid and limit interactions with. And in that case, you would probably just try to set a limit or get away or something like that. Now, there may be a situation, though, where you do want to get closer to the person who's aggressive and insulting.
And I might say that in my therapeutic work, probably in my personal life as well, I mean, I've gone both ways on that, but there have been times when people were very insulting toward me and aggressive. And then I used the 5 secrets, and they turned into my greatest allies. And it's a tremendous joy when that happens. Why don't we just briefly, before we get into inquiry, which is the technique for today, although we could use the inquiry as one of the responses to a person like that, why don't we talk about how we could use the 5 secrets and the disarming technique if we wanted to get close? And one of my points here is that I would personally never say to a person, it's not appropriate for you to say things like that to me in an angry tone, because that's like trying to control the other person. And when you say that, you'll actually force them to get angrier because you're kind of scolding them and telling them they're being a bad boy or a bad girl or something like that. But I don't think it's important to stay calm. I think it's okay to be feeling anxious and upset, but you want to communicate in a respectful way if you want to get closer to that person. But I would say to use inquiry, which is the technique we're going to be focusing on today, which is asking gentle probing questions to learn more about what the other person is thinking and feeling, to say something like, wow, Jim, or whoever the person is, I'm feeling a little hurt and put down right now. That would be an I feel statement. And then, and I'm getting the feeling that you're really ticked off at me, and I'm wondering if you can tell me more about that, what, things I've done or said that have hurt your feelings or irritated you or angered you. I really want to hear what you have to say.
Yeah.
How's that?
I think that sounds wonderful, and I think that one of the keys in there was the I feel statement to let the person know how their aggressive and insulting tone affected you, but in a non kind of inflammatory way.
Yes, and I'll give you another example that came up on the hike today, and I'll disguise the details to protect the identity of the hiker, but we had a hiker, let's say, we'll call him Sal, and he's just moved here, we'll say from Colorado, to pursue a new job in Silicon Valley, but his wife and children are staying behind in Colorado until they can figure out how they're going to move here and if things are going to work out. So they're temporarily separated. And Sal said that he gets kind of lonely. He's a really nice guy, really handsome guy, and seems to have just wonderful personality and kind of open, vulnerable, and really cool guy. And so he says, I called her, and this has been a pattern. Last night, I was lonesome and just wanted to just talk to her for 15 minutes and get a little, refueling and just make a little contact. And he called her and she said, this isn't a good time. I'm just really busy preparing, for my such and such at work. And apparently she has this job and she's very obsessive and she's constantly working hard and preparing, and then he didn't know what to do or how to handle that. So we talked about how he could be using inquiry. It's a perfect example. Here's someone against them treating you in a kind of a shabby way, and she's blown him off this way several times when he's tried to call her and make contact, and feels kind of cold and a little bit mean-spirited. How would you suggest Helen responding to her if you were Sal, or even approaching her on this issue? Call again and raise it as an issue.
I have to admit, my mind wandered for a moment, and I did not pay close attention to what.
Well, David, that's because what you were saying is incredibly boring. Well, I'll model, or maybe you want to give it a shot, Fabrice.
Well, I'll give it a shot. It sounds like you're rather busy and occupied right now, and I understand that you don't have really the bandwidth to listen to me at this time. I know it's kind of late, and I'm feeling a little bit lonely right now, and really hope that we can reconnect at some point. But I really respect your needs, and if you want to tell me more at some point, just we can call later, or you can call me.
I think that's really terrific. What would you say?
Oh yeah, I thought that was wonderful.
Yeah. Another angle on it would be to then when you call later, you could say Sarah. I don't know if you've noticed, but sometimes when I've been calling you, there's been some tension in the air between the two of us, and sometimes I felt kind of like I've been kind of given the throw cold water on the face or something, like you're not wanting to talk to me. And I've been feeling kind of hurt and lonely, and I've been asking myself what's going on between the two of us. And I don't know, maybe you're feeling a loss of love for me, or maybe you're angry with me, or maybe you found someone else who's another love interest. You're certainly a beautiful woman and a wonderful woman, but I'm just feeling kind of out in the cold, the last few weeks, and I wonder if you've noticed it and what you think is happening. How are you experiencing it? And again, that would be just opening the door. It's all also what I would call feeling multiple choice empathy. Mm-hmm. Like maybe it's this, maybe it's this, maybe it's this. Can you tell me tell me what's going on? And one of the points that came up on the hike, see, what he's been trying to do is solve the problem, get her to spend more time with him. And then he'll say things like, well, you're not spending any time with me on the phone. And then she'll get angry and say, oh, you're just making me feel guilty. You're trying to make me feel guilty, that type of thing. And I've often said the attempt to solve problems in relationships is the cause of all relationship problems, and the refusal to solve them is the solution to all relationship problems. And some people understand me when I say that, and some people don't get it. But the idea is, the answer for him is not to try to get her to talk more on the phone, because that's like, then she'll feel judged, and like she's doing something wrong, and she'll feel pressured and she'll get more defensive. Instead, to change the focus to say, here's what's going on, and here it seems to be happening, and here's how I'm feeling, and I'm wondering if you can tell me how you're feeling. And often when people share their feelings openly, then the so-called real problem gets solved more or less automatically.
Don't you think, though, that people need a way to be able to ask for what's important to them?
Yeah, absolutely, and show us how you might do that.
Sure. So let's say I'm Sal. I think that it's important to before I go into Sal's voice, you probably need to use the 5 secrets first, so that there's good feelings between the two people. But then, let's say once you've got that good feeling, Sal could say something like, I really love it when we spend time together, and it would mean a lot to me if we made some time in our schedules to talk on the phone, even when weeks are busy. What do you think about that? That's
beautiful too. Yeah, and you could add some stroking to that, because I love you a lot. You're my special person, and men have feelings too, and sometimes we feel hurt and lonely, and absolutely. Well, let's get into... go ahead.
Before you move on, I just want to be sure that we answered Kat's question fully. I know that she said, how do you stay calm when somebody is being aggressive with you? Maybe you don't need to stay calm, and you said that. But she may be also thinking of the fact that if you're anxious and upset when somebody's talking to you, you may not have your wits together to be able to use the 5 secrets, hence the need for us to calm ourselves down.
Well, I love what you're saying, and we might even want to set aside, after we've gone through each of the 5 secrets, and then once we start doing integrative broadcasts on how to combine them in a variety of common human situations, talk about the inner solution and the outer solution, and how it would sometimes. I mean, we did this on the hike today too with another hiker who was busy telling herself, I'm no good, I'm a loser, when she's interacting with other people, which then makes it very difficult to use the 5 secrets. And we have inner dialogue. We're talking to ourselves at the same time we're talking to that other person. And if you're giving yourself messages that make you feel ashamed or guilty or enraged or overly anxious, then, as you point out so wisely, it's much harder to use the 5 secrets in a skillful way. And I think that's one of the reasons that relationship problems are so so challenging because you really have two enemies when you have a conflict with another person. One is the actual person, and you need to learn to communicate more skillfully, but the other opponent really is yourself, the messages that you're giving yourself. Is that the kind of thing you were thinking about?
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking about, and it doesn't seem straightforward on how to address this, because I can't just say, hey, why don't we push the pause button? I'm going to go do a mood journal right now, and I'll be back to you in 20 minutes.
Yeah, exactly. Although sometimes you may have to do that.
You may have to do that sometimes.
And we'll talk about how to do a daily mood log and change that inner dialogue.
And oftentimes we are these are not one-time situations. There may be somebody that we're having to repeatedly interact with who there might be conflict with, and so you can practice. This is a good thing to do homework for, so that if you rehearse basically the situation, you'll be more ready when it arises again.
Okay. One more question from listeners here. This is directed to Helen.
Okay.
And this was, I might have forwarded this to you, but I thought it'd be fun for you to talk about it live on the air here. Mm-hmm. This is from Rob. Now, Rob is one of almost maybe my number one fan in the whole world. And he is just a wonderful person. He's come to a number of my workshops. He's a very, very smart guy. He's a very open and vulnerable guy, and he often comments brilliantly on our podcasts and things like that. So he's, thank you, Rob. And so Rob writes to David, Helen is right! ! I say this respectfully, but her husband should not behave that way. Or whoever the person is. Did we say it was your husband? Or yeah. And I feel that Helen is beating up on herself for having that feeling. There's something beautiful about her desire not to have to listen to someone's complaining and negativity, in traffic. I get the point, though. The best way to stop the unwanted behavior is not to fight against it, but to disarm and empathize. Or take Uber instead. So the question I will ask myself is, how do I get the outcome I want? The very point you were making a moment ago. Fighting or diplomacy, along with disarming and empathy. And he says, David, you're a goat. Greatest of all time.
That's the best part of it.
That's letter. Why he's my top fan. Right. So I just thought I'd give you a chance to comment on that. Helen.
Yes, that's a great letter from Rob, and Rob did a great job of disarming me. So he said that Helen is right, and so nice job with disarming me, Rob. And actually, when David forwarded me this email, it's interesting how disarming works. As soon as I read that Helen is right, I felt even less attached to my point of view. So it just shows the power of disarming, that when someone finds truth in what you're saying, you become less attached to it. So I would say that, well, first of all, I don't think I'm beating myself up on getting irritated. I think it's perfectly natural and okay of me to feel irritated, and it's okay for me not to want to listen to someone else's negative comments.
Why need moaning and complaining?
Well, that's maybe
not your
going
husband,
too far.
but if
in
that
general,
were the case, yes.
right. Not my husband. Got to underline that. But I think you could also say there's a time and a place for everything, and so right in that moment, let's say if the driver is saying, oh, that guy ran a stop sign, that's not the ideal time to say, I wish we wouldn't comment on drivers. So because it
fuels the fire.
It fuels the fire, exactly. So in fact, I have said at non-driving times that, I'd love it if you just let those go, so that you don't call attention to bad drivers. And in fact, my husband did stop making those comments. So,
way to go, Helen.
yeah, so I think you should think about basically timing and the concept, I guess, of a teachable moment. When is somebody ready?
And also, if
open
it's done
to-
in the context of a loving, trusting interaction rather than some scolding, demanding type of thing.
And that's another example of what you were demonstrating earlier, a way to issue a request, but not while you're having a conflict.
Yes.
Once you're in a good place.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well that's great stuff. Now let's talk about inquiry in no particular order, but we want to give people a homework assignment, and I'll give it now.
Okay.
So we don't forget at the end. But remember, each week we're teaching one technique. Now, usually you'll integrate them to have an effective response to someone. You don't have to do all 5, but you might use 1 or 2 of them or 3 of them, sometimes all 5 of them. But we want you to just do inquiry try to do 5 times a day. And inquiry just means to ask gentle probing questions to find out more about what the other person is thinking and feeling. And there's all kinds of fantastic applications of this technique that we'll talk about today. But to just give you, I just want you to do it in a kind of trivial way, not any intense conflict situations, but just in your everyday life. Just get, even with strangers, you can ask gentle questions, and they generally like it, expressing some interest in them. Like Helen will now give us a wonderful example of that.
Well, I was just going to say, can you tell us more about what you mean, David? I just got one.
There you go. Now, did you feel put on the spot just then?
I was
I just got one. So you just ask people questions, and it's really cool. Or you could be I found this. When we moved back here to California, this is a trivial example. We went into this restaurant in Palo Alto called Jing Jing's. And I remember taking my wife there years earlier when we were just kind of boyfriend-girlfriend type of thing. And I asked it, were you here like in 1969 or something like that? And did it have the same name? Because I remember it was arranged differently, and then they got all excited and they talked about the restaurant and when they'd taken over and what the previous owner was. And they were just happy that I was expressing an interest in them. And you can do it with, I used to have crippling social anxiety. And now I just talk to people everywhere. In fact, I was working with someone on today's hike who felt very, very shy and has been afraid her whole life to open up. And I said, let's just walk up to some strangers on the hike and just tell them that you felt shy and worthless all of your life, and that you're opening up to people, and you're not going to hide it anymore, and see what happens. She was just terrified to do that. I said, you must. This is a requirement, you must do this. So we came across these 2 elderly men. I mentioned this to you before. Fabrice came with dogs. I said, go up and tell them. And she was very scared. And she went in and said, I've been shy all my life and afraid of opening up, and I'm ashamed, and I never talk to people, and so I'm going to get over that today. And so I'm telling you guys. And they were just so kind. And then this one fellow, he said, well, I've had a tough time too. And she said, oh, well, how come? And he said, well, I had to escape from Nazi Germany. And I felt pretty shy too, I felt pretty alone in my own life. Then she just started asking him questions. She just opened up. I almost brought tears to my eyes, just like the greatest friend in the world, and just blew her mind. And then she said to the other fellow, I've been real shy, and what do you think about me? I've been, hiding it all my life. And he said, you're a beautiful young woman, and I just feel so close to you. And then she says, well, tell me about yourself. And then he too was an immigrant and had had a tough time. And they just opened up to her, just like flowers or something. And she couldn't believe it, that she was able to develop such a beautiful, close relationship with two total strangers she just walked up to. And I said, yeah, it's the doors of perception, like Aldous Huxley, was that his name? The book, The Doors of Perception, about LSD, like the world can suddenly open up. I said, this isn't LSD, but you've thought the world was filled with monsters, and you ask questions, you talk to people, ask them about themselves, and suddenly the world opens up. And then she did that with many more people, and it was just really touching every single time. People are lonely. The world is filled with lonely people, not monsters. There are monsters out there, but 99% of people are warm and human and lonely, and you just ask them questions about themselves. And so you can, if you get on a bus, you can say, how far is it to such and such? That's an inquiry. Or ask the bus driver, how long have you been driving
Even
this route?
monsters like to be asked about themselves.
Exactly, yes. They often are the most receptive because nobody says anything nice to them, so they're generally grateful. So that's your assignment. Now we're going to, and also some people have been telling me, Dr. Burns, I'm doing your assignments. I've been doing the disarming, and then someone asked me on the hike here, how would you disarm someone who criticizes themselves rather than criticizes you? And then we practiced that. He said, oh, I see how to do that now. Mm-hmm. And people have been writing and saying that they're doing the practice. But if you do this practice, then by the end of 7 days of doing this, 3, 4, 5 times a day, you'll be good at inquiry, and then you can begin to use it in these more sophisticated examples that we'll talk about now. And you had some fabulous ideas about that, Ellen. And
Yeah, when we thought about this topic, the first thing I thought of was that there's sort of a stereotype of therapists saying things like, tell me more, or how do you feel about that? That's kind of like this stereotypical therapist response. Yeah. And certainly if you say it in a kind of formulaic way, or if that's all you ever say, it doesn't sound good. But actually people really like to be asked those questions, and it feels really good when you're asked that question in a sincere way, because it indicates that the person, whether it's a therapist or somebody else in your life, really wants to know what your experience was and doesn't want to know just at a superficial level. They want to know your feelings about it, or they want to know your feelings in depth. And this doesn't always occur in ordinary conversation. And so when you do have this type of back and forth with someone, it's really wonderful and healing and brings people closer together.
Can you tell me a bit more about that?
That might be a formulaic
example. That's a great point.
But I mean, you can use that formula at least once just to draw the person out.
Yeah.
And once they begin to give you more specifics, you can say, oh, and how about that part when you did that? And and what happened after? So then you can start branching out when you get more of the meat of what they want to tell you.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I've actually done that as an exercise, like if I'm on an airplane, just to see if it works, and to talk to the person next to me and force myself to start asking them
And then you
questions.
wish you had a different seat.
No, it was effective. Like I asked this guy, what do you do? And he says, oh, I'm a coal engineer. And he says, I work in coal mines and devise the tunnels. And I sort of said, oh, that's really interesting. You ever find like weird things down there? And he said, oh yeah, sometimes we find like dinosaur remains and nice stuff. And I said, well, tell me about that. He started talking, all chattering about that. And I said, how much does coal cost? And, I said, suppose I wanted to buy 100 pounds of coal or something. Mm-hmm. How much would it cost? It's only about like 75 cents or something.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's like real cheap. And, he was just happy as could be. I don't think anyone had ever asked him about his, coal.
Yes, you had a sincere desire to get to know him, and that feels really good to people.
Yeah. Now, you made a point earlier, is that we're kind of a self-centered culture to a certain extent, and that we're often talking about ourselves. And in the last podcast, we talked about this error that the therapists sometimes make of when a patient is upset, you start talking about yourself as if you're so important, they're going to be so impressed with your experiences, and they get left out in the cold. But when you use inquiry, you're asking people to talk about themselves. You're expressing an interest in them, and it's kind of like an other-centered kind of conversation.
Yeah.
Don't you think that sometimes people don't really like to talk about themselves? Like, just divert the conversation away from me. Haven't you encountered people like this?
Yes, I definitely have.
So,
that's tricky.
So it may depend on the context.
Yeah, you don't want to force somebody.
Yeah, then we need to develop a trust first.
Exactly.
Yes, in fact, when I was down in Anaheim, maybe I shouldn't say this, but
if you lead with that, usually the answer is you shouldn't.
Well, I was at this wonderful conference, this Evolution of Psychotherapy conference, and it was fantastic. It was just Jeffrey Zeig from Phoenix puts it on with the Ericksonian, and it was blow away. I mean, it was just so user-friendly. And one of my presentations on Thursday morning, 2,000 people were there. And they were like cheering and laughing and applauding. I showed the Jumping Jacks videotape.
Okay.
And they absolutely ate it up. But at any rate, they had like luncheons for us. And I didn't know any of the people. I'm pretty shy. And so there was this one woman that, I said, who are you? And she said, I'm so-and-so. You've probably heard of me,
Did you say, no, I haven't?
And she had some book that's been out for quite a while, fairly well-known book, and it's all about being real and being vulnerable and not being fake, and stuff like that. And so I was using inquiry because I was so anxious, and I was trying to get her to tell me about her book, and then she was talking about how important it is to be open and vulnerable and stuff, and how shame is the worst emotion, and I said, I agree. I often feel ashamed, in my teaching, if I'll get a criticism from students, and I feel ashamed, and then I feel like I have to hide my shame because it's so shameful to feel ashamed. And I said, hey, have you sometimes, struggled with shame as well? She says, oh, yes. And I said, well, tell me about the things that you're ashamed of. And she says, I don't want to talk about it. She got real snippy.
Oh, gosh. Did she ask you who you were?
No.
Oh, that would have been awesome if you got to say the David Burns.
But I introduced myself as David. And there was another woman that sat down and said, who are you? And she, my name's David. And she was really nice. And then she came up to me about 10 minutes later. She said, or are you the David Burns? That's me. She said, I'm so glad you introduced yourself as David. Everyone else is saying, I'm so-and-so.
Yeah.
You probably have read my book, type of thing. But anyway, getting back to this, it can be very helpful for shy people, and I struggled with horrible social anxiety for much of my life, and just to talk to people and ask them questions about themselves is really neat, especially if you're shy, to have other-centered conversations. And I've given shy people the instruction is go out and talk to 5 strangers every day and ask them about themselves. Use the disarming technique. Agree with them. Use stroking. Compliment them. Use thought and feeling empathy. Acknowledge how their feelings, but you don't need to talk about yourself.
Right. Because, in social anxiety or people who get nervous talking to other people, there's so much focus on themselves. What if I say something stupid? What if I look stupid?
Yes.
So inquiry and thinking about asking the other person questions shifts the focus from all the self this shifts the focus from the self to the other person.
Yes, absolutely. Now, what would we say to listeners who say, "Oh, I'm too nervous to go out and ask people questions"?
That's exactly why you should do it.
That's right.
Exactly.
And
You
it
mean
will
I
get
have
easier.
to? But how could I do this if I'm real anxious?
Nobody has to do it, but if they'd like to get over their anxiety, that's the price that they have to pay.
There we go. I love that. Now, there are errors. Well, there's a lot of other quick points we want to make about the inquiry. One of the errors, this is important for therapists, as well as for mothers and fathers who have maybe a child who's upset, or you have a friend who's upset, and if that person is criticizing you, you can use inquiry as one of the techniques. But often the therapist will say, the patient will say, "Oh, you're not helping me, and you don't care about me," or something. I'll say, "Well, what could I do that would be more helpful to you?" That sounds like inquiry. Why is that a poor response?
Because that is not asked in the spirit of trying to get closer to the other person. That's asking the therapist or whatever is asking the critique or the patient to solve the problem, and so that's not really trying to make a connection. It's more like how can I?
Yeah,
you tell me how to fix this.
Yeah. It's kind of like saying, "Let's shut up. I don't want to hear
Yeah.
any more about your anger and your complaining, and let's make nice, or let's go on to something else." And then a better inquiry would be, "Can you tell me more about what I've said or done that hurt your feelings or angered you? Tell me about the problems I haven't been helping you with. Tell me about how it feels. Tell me about your anger and your disappointment." That's like opening the door.
Absolutely. It's like, I'll take everything that you already gave me and I want more. That you're just so open to whatever the person has to say. And that really has a profound effect on the recipient.
Yeah, but it takes courage to use these techniques because
Yeah.
we're afraid of hearing these things sometimes. You made another tremendous point earlier about errors with inquiry. You say, why can't you say to somebody, "Well, why do you feel that way?" Isn't that a good inquiry?
Right. So the problem with that one is you're asking the person to justify their point of view. And that's putting them on the spot, and is also not in the spirit of being open to whatever the other person has to say.
Also, when you ask a why question, it puts you in your head. You become you rationalize thing, and you're not really listening to your own feelings.
Yeah.
Good point.
And it's like a debate. Why do you feel that way? It's like saying you're a jerk, you're wrong.
Right.
Right. Admit what a loser you are, type of thing. Do you have other point? I had one thing I wanted to end up with here, but
yeah, I had maybe just elaborations on this that in these podcast listeners are hearing about all the 5 secrets, and I think if you skip inquiry and just use 4 secrets, it will be kind of a stingy version because you're saying that you will, let's say, disarm and use I feel and thought empathy and feeling empathy with the information the patient gave you
or
the friend or whatever, but you're not open to anything else. So I think by adding inquiry, it's very generous and open and saying, I got everything that you just told me, and I'm open to hearing anything else, or I really want to know your point of view.
Yeah, that sounds like a really good point. I hadn't really considered that before, but it's true that if you use 4 secrets, it's like every time you kind of like, in a way, you deflect whatever criticism is coming at you, but you don't follow through with it. You don't go along with the person. You just wait until they come back, until they don't come back anymore.
Yeah.
Like you said, it's very stingy.
Yeah. Another important point about inquiry, and then I had a quick story on it if we have time for it, but to do it as the last thing, we're doing it third in the podcast because we're just doing things in the order that they are on the EAR: empathy, disarming, empathy, inquiry, I feel, statements, and stroking. But in a conversation, you always want to end with inquiry. If you have it halfway through and say, I want to hear more about that, but then you go on and say other things, it's like saying, I don't really want to hear what you have to say. That's a minor point. Now, inquiry has a tremendous application, and stroking also, in job applications or college applications. Most people who are applying for positions make the mistake of trying to impress the interviewer with yourself, and that puts you under pressure.
You mean face-to-face, not on a written application?
Yeah.
Interview.
An interview. Yeah, that's what I mean. Thank you. Yeah. And generally, people who are interviewing for jobs or schools, they don't care that much about you. Who do they care about?
Well, themselves.
That's right. And so if you get them talking about themselves and stroke them and show an interest in them, you'll often come out way ahead of the other candidates who are trying to impress the interviewer. And I can give a quick example of that. You know that I went to medical school. I'm a medical doctor like yourself, but I wasn't a pre-medical student in college. And an Amherst advisor told me to apply to medical school. I said, I'm not a pre-medical student. And he said, oh, we'll just apply anyway. I'm sure you'll get in. And he thought it would be better to be a psychiatrist than a psychologist. And in retrospect, I should have, I think, been a psychologist. Would have been more up my alley. But at any rate, I got I got an interview at Stanford Medical School. I don't think we've talked on the podcast about it.
I don't recall that, actually. No.
So I got an interview at Stanford, and so I was pretty nervous because he'll be asking me about my research, and well, I don't have any. Were you a chemistry major, David, or biology? No, sir, I was a philosophy major.
Did you spend a lot of time on your motorcycle?
Well, in medical school.
Okay. That came
later. That came about as a result of this interview, actually. And I met this fellow in the basement at Stanford of the museum, where they have
Cantor, yeah.
Yeah, and under there was the anatomy building, and I had all the cadavers down there. Mm-hmm. And so I was thinking, I don't want this guy to ask me too much about myself. So I shot a question at him, and I said, God, it's kind of dark. Gosh, it's kind of dark and creepy down here. Is this where the medical students cut up the bodies? And I said, isn't that kind of weird having your office down here? And he says, oh, no, it's actually really neat down here. My laboratory is right down the hall. And so I said, oh, would you be willing to show me your laboratory? I'd love to, find out about your research and what you're doing. He said, oh, I'd love to show you my laboratory. So we went down there, and we went in the laboratory, and there was all these different machines. And so I would read the name of the machine, which I have no idea what it was. So, I see you've got one of those inverse thromboscopic, Potter's EB machines. Yeah. How cool. How do you use that in your research? And then he would, he got all excited. Oh, we do that. We're studying the blah, blah, blah. And I had no idea what he was talking about. And I said, that is so cool. Tell me more about that. And I kept just using stroking and inquiry. And I think the guy was just so incredibly lonely or something. Mm-hmm. He just was talking, and I just kept using inquiry and telling him how neat I thought everything was. I had no idea though what he was talking about. And then after a while, he looked at his watch and he says, "My goodness, it's 4:15. I've been talking to you for 2 hours. We were only supposed to have had a 15-minute." Interview scheduled, and I've got an important meeting over at the medical school right now. Here, come with me. We can walk across the quad together and keep talking. I said, hey, that sounds fine. As we were walking the steps out of that basement under the grassy area, he put his hand on my shoulder and he says, I don't think I haven't found out what your name is yet. Who are you anyway?
Yeah, right. random guy.
And I just said, "Oh, I'm David Burns from Amherst College." And then he patted my shoulder and he says, "Well, David Burns, I want you to know you're the kind of young man we need at the Stanford Medical School." And I said, "Well, it's really nice to hear you say that, but unfortunately, I don't believe I'll be able to come here to medical school." And he says, "What do you mean you're not going to come to Stanford Medical School? Of course you're going to come to Stanford Medical School. Did you think Harvard is going to make a better offer?" And I said, "Well, no, it's not like that, but my father's a Lutheran minister, and we don't have any money, and when the church offers him a raise, he always turns it down. And he also believes that borrowing money is a sin. And so I wouldn't be allowed to borrow money. And I've heard that it would cost more than $100,000 to go to the Stanford Medical School. So there's no way I'd be able to come here." And he says, "That's ridiculous. I'm the chairman of the admissions committee, and I'm going to the admissions committee meeting right now. And I want you to know you're the number one prospect for this class. And tomorrow you're going to get an acceptance letter that you're accepted to the Stanford Medical School, and you're never going to have to pay a penny. We're going to pay everything."
Wow.
And I said, "Well, that's an offer I can't refuse."
And that's actually what happened?
That's what happened. That's why I ended up at Stanford Medical School.
Well, that's quite a story, yeah.
But it was just inquiry,
Yeah.
and stroking, and shows the power of expressing an interest in another human being. You say, "Well, that's some bizarre story that David told. That would never work for me." I taught the same thing to my daughter, and she's had many job interviews for a lot of different jobs, and she says she's every place, anytime she's ever applied for jobs, she just finds out who's going to interview her, does a little research on them ahead of time, and then gets them talking about themselves. And she says she's always been offered every job she's ever applied for. And she giggles about it. We laugh about it. She says, "It's like, I feel like I'm cheating." Also, I taught this to law students at Penn. When there were too many law students coming out onto the market, I became the referral shrink for the Penn Law School. I taught them how to use this in interviews, because they'd have like 50 top law students for every position. Because the time, this was like, I don't know, it was years ago, but there was too many attorneys on the market, and students would come to me that they'd been, turned down everywhere, and then teach them to do this, and then they said they would get offered every single interview. They would win every single interview doing this, to find out about who's the person interviewing. Say, "Well, tell me about the firm. What's it been like for you? Would you recommend this? And what would you be looking for in a young attorney? What would be a good fit here?" And just to be human, to form a human connection.
We probably should make the point it wouldn't work if you were thinking you were going to manipulate your way into the situation.
If you come across in a phony, manipulative way, it's not going to work. Right. It has to come from the heart, and you also have to show yourself with some dignity and some class, as well. So it's somewhat sophisticated, but this is a simple little technique we've shown you in today's podcast, inquiry, asking people, simple probing questions to show a sincere interest in them, and it can make a profound difference in your life, in a conflict with strangers, and many different applications of this apparently simplistic technique.
All right. I think that concludes our podcast for today. Thank you so much for joining us, Helen. You bring so much pep into our podcast. So
pep as well as a lot of wisdom.
Absolutely,
and beautiful statements.
And also, some diversity, because the two of us are getting kind of like boring, I'm sure, and Helen has always some really interesting ideas that really add a lot of novelty to our podcast.
Thank you so
Absolutely.
much. It's a lot of fun for me to participate. Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
This has been another episode of the Feeling Good podcast. For more information, visit Dr. Burns' website at feelinggood.com, where you will find the show notes for this podcast under the blog page, and where you can leave your comments and questions. The website has an abundance of resources for therapists as well as non-therapists, including books, workshops, a list of online training groups around the world, and much more. Theme music is Gypsy Jazz in Paris, 1935, composed and performed by Brett Van Donsel. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and I invite you to join us next time for another episode of the Feeling Good podcast.